Today we're going to read a couple of chapters of Stuart Little, and chapter 2 is called Home Problems. And here's a little picture. Stuart was also helpful when it came to ping pong. The Littles liked ping pong, but dolls had a way of rolling under the chairs, sofas, radiators, and this meant the players were forever stooping down and reaching under things. Stuart soon learned to chase balls, and it was a great sight to see him come out from under a hot radiator, pushing a ping pong ball with all his might, the perspiration rolling down his cheeks. The ball, of course, was almost as high as he was, and he had to throw his whole weight against it in order to keep it rolling. The Littles had a grand piano in their living room, which was all right, except that one of the keys was a sticky key and didn't work properly. Mrs. Little said she thought it must be the damp weather, but I don't see how it could be the damp weather, for the key had been sticking for about 4 years, during which time there had been many bright, clear days. But anyway, the key stuck, and it was a great inconvenience to anyone trying to play the piano. It bothered George particularly when he was playing the scarf dance, which was rather lively. It was George who had the idea of stationing Stuart inside the piano to push the key up the second it was played. This was no easy job for Stuart, as he had to crouch down between the felt hammers so that he wouldn't get hit on the head. But Stuart liked it just the same. It was exciting inside the piano, dodging about, and the noise was quite terrific. Sometimes, after a long session, he would emerge quite deaf, as though he had just stepped out of an airplane after a long journey, and it would be some time before he really felt normal again. Mr. and Mrs. Little often discussed Stuart quietly between themselves when he wasn't around, for they had never quite recovered from the shock and surprise of having a mouse in the family. He was so very tiny, and he presented so many problems to his parents. Mr. Little said, for one thing, there must be no references to mice in their conversation. He made Mrs. Little tear from the nursery songbook the page about the 3 blind mice, see how they run. I don't want Stuart to get a lot of notions in his head, said Mr. Little. I should feel badly having my son growing up fearing that a farmer's wife was going to cut off his tail with a carving knife. It's such things that make children dream bad dreams when they go to bed at night. Here's another little picture of Stuart. Yes, replied Mrs. Little, and I think we had a better start thinking about the poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. I think it might embarrass Stuart to hear mice mentioned in such a belittling manner. That's right, said her husband, but what shall we say when we come to that line in the poem? We'll have to say something. We can't just say 'twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring. That doesn't sound complete. It needs a word to rhyme with house. What about louse, said Mrs. Little. Or grouse, said Mr. Little. I suggest souse, remarked George, who had been listening to their conversation from across the room. It was decided that louse was the best substitute for mouse, so when Christmas came around, Mrs. Little carefully rubbed out the word mouse from the poem and wrote in the word louse, and Stuart always thought the poem went this way. 'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a louse. The thing that worried Mr. Little most was the mouse hole in the pantry. The hole had been made by some mice in the days before the Littles came to live in the house, and nothing had been done about stopping it up. Mr. Little was not at all sure that he understood Stuart's real feeling about the mouse hole. He didn't know where the hole led to, and it made him uneasy to think that Stuart might someday feel the need to venture into it. After all, he does look a great deal like a mouse, said Mr. Little to his wife, and I've never seen a mouse yet that doesn't like to go into a hole. Can you see that little tiny hole? Next is chapter 3, called Washing Up. And here's the picture at the beginning of the chapter. Stuart was an early riser, and he almost always was the first person up in the morning. He liked the feeling of being the first one stirring. He enjoyed the quiet rooms with the books standing still on the shelves, the pale light coming in through the windows, and the fresh smell of the day. In wintertime, it would be quite dark when he crawled from his bed made out of a cigarette box, and he sometimes shivered with cold as he stood in his nightgown doing his exercises. Stuart touched his toes 10 times every morning to keep himself in good condition. He had seen his brother George do it, and George explained that it kept the stomach muscles firm and was a fine abdominal thing to do. After exercising, Stuart would slip on his handsome wool wrapper, tie the cord tightly around his waist, and start for the bathroom, creeping silently through the long dark hall past his father and mother's room, past the hall closet where the carpet sweeper was kept, past George's room, and along by the head of the stairs until he got to the bathroom. Of course, the bathroom would be dark too, but Stuart's father had thoughtfully tied a long string to the pull chain of the light. The string reached clear to the floor. By grasping it as high up as he could and throwing his whole weight into it, Stuart was able to turn on the light. Swinging on the string this way, with his long bathrobe trailing around his ankles, he looked like a little old friar pulling the bell rope in an abbey. To get to the wash basin, Stuart had to climb a tiny rope ladder which his father had fixed for him. George had promised to build Stuart a small, special wash basin, only 1 inch high and with a little rubber tube through which water would flow, but George was always saying he was going to build something and then forgetting about it. Stuart just went ahead and climbed the rope ladder to the family wash basin every morning to wash his face and brush his teeth. Mrs. Little had provided him with a doll-sized toothbrush, a doll-sized cake of soap, a doll-sized washcloth, and a doll's comb, which he used for combing his whiskers. He carried these things in his bathrobe pocket, and when he reached the top of the ladder, he took them out, laid them neatly in a row, and set about the task of turning the water on. For such a small fellow, turning the water on was quite a problem. He had discussed it with his father one day after making several unsuccessful attempts. "I can get up on the faucet all right," he explained, "but I can't seem to turn it on because I have nothing to brace my feet against." "Yes, I know," his father replied. "That's the whole trouble." George, who always listened to conversations whenever he could, said that in his opinion they ought to construct a brace for Stuart. And with that, he got out some boards, a saw, a hammer, a screwdriver, a brand awl, and some nails, and started making a terrific fuss in the bathroom, building what he said was going to be a brace for Stuart. But he soon became interested in something else and disappeared, leaving the tools lying around all over the bathroom floor. Stuart, after examining the mess, turned to his father again. "Maybe I could pound the faucet with something and turn it on that way," he said. So Stuart's father provided him with a very small, light hammer made of wood, and Stuart found that by swinging it 3 times around his head and letting it come down with a crash on the handle of the faucet, he could start a thin stream of water flowing, enough to brush his teeth in anyway and to moisten a washcloth. So every morning after climbing to the basin, he would seize his hammer and pound the faucet, and the other members of the household, dozing in their beds, would hear the sharp plink, plink, plink of Stuart's hammer like a faraway blacksmith, telling them that the day had come and that Stuart was trying to brush his teeth.